Good evening, everyone. My name is Lucia Dolce. I'm the chair of the Center of Buddhist Studies here at SOAS, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this double book launch that will celebrate the latest research of two young scholars that we are very pleased to have here at the center, well, virtually at the center. I'm very glad that we have managed to hold this event. It has been postponed for many months. We have had one of our speakers tonight, Dr. Lee, at SOAS for almost a year. Basically, he arrived the week before lockdown, the first lockdown. Seems kind of a long time ago, but it's been a pretty curious experience, I think, 1 year in lockdown at SOAS. And we really wanted to have to give an occasion to present his research. His book came out at the beginning of last year. But then postponing, we ended up having the pleasure to match it with another book on a similar topic that came out at the end of last year. So this, I will say something more, of course, in a minute about the authors and their works. But I hope that we hope that this occasion will be a moment to reflect on research on one of the most important notions in Buddhism, that of Buddha nature and Tathāgatagarbha, and to compare different methodologies, different findings, and in different geographical contexts. But before we start with the proceedings of tonight, I'd like to say a word on a different note. As we were sending out the announcement for this event, the news reached us that Professor David Selfhood Ruegg had passed away. And so we would like to use a few minutes before we start the event to say a few words on Professor Ruegg, who was such a towering figure in the field and exactly related to the topic we will be talking about today. And I've asked my colleague Ulrich Pagel to say a few words, as Professor Ruegg was a professor at SOAS and professor associated later, and Ulrich knew him pretty well. So Ulrich, if you want to start. Unmute yourself, please.
Yes, thank you, Lucia. My name is Ulrich Pagel. I work at SOAS in history, religions, and philosophies in Buddhist studies, predominantly. And like many of us, I learned of the death of David Ruegg. He died on the 2nd of February, only a few weeks ago, and he died of COVID, as we know. And David worked at SOAS. He worked or was associated with the religions department for almost 25 years. I thought it would be appropriate to note his passing in this context today. As Lucia said, he was a towering figure in Buddhist studies and Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. Perhaps one of his most groundbreaking works were, of course, on the Tathāgatagarbha, which sprang from his PhD work. David, of course, held a number of prestigious positions over the years. He started in Paris, he went to Leiden, he was in Washington and then Hamburg before he returned to London, where he worked as an independent scholar. I myself and many of my colleagues at SOAS benefited from his mentorship over many years. He was always very generous in sharing his knowledge, terribly demanding, but also very, very warm and welcoming in his work. So we all benefited in so many ways from his contributions personally. We also benefited through his seminars that he conducted at SOAS, at the Jordan lectures, Numata lectures. There was a whole range of activities that he brought to SOAS. So in many ways, SOAS owes a great deal to him. I remember on one occasion, as a gesture of great generosity, I think he donated his entire Jordan lectures stipendium to the library to purchase parts of the Tibetan Kangyur with that money. So Soros owes him a great debt, and in recognition of that, and of course in recognition of his personal friendship, me and my colleagues will be organizing an event to celebrate his scholarly life. We'll do that in later in the year, of course, probably in the fall, or maybe in the winter 2021. And that will be then an opportunity for all of us to come together to acknowledge his very significant contribution to Buddhist studies, and acknowledge his influence on so many people through his work. And I see Christopher here. Christopher, very nice to see you again. We haven't seen for a long time, and all the other speakers assembled here today. We all drew and continue to draw on his publications, on his insight. So that is really all what I want to say. This is a book launch. This is a happy event that we don't want to have overshadowed from that, but it is good always to remember the giants on whose shoulders we stand in our own work in that context. Thank you so much for giving me a platform to do that, Lucia.
Thank you, Oresho. Thanks. Yes, this is a celebration, not a commemoration, but to remember previous scholars is a moment to celebrate their legacy. And I think that is what we will see also in the talks and the presentations that both Chris and Zijie will do today. So let me go on with the introductions then. As I mentioned, the two books that we will be introducing today speak in different ways of the concept of Tathāgatagarbha. And I think it's interesting to see them together because they highlight the different emphasis in sources and in concerns that different Buddhist communities found in relation to this concept. So the importance of local development that often gets lost in the general history of Buddhism that we look at. It's certainly something that I hope will come out today. I think also because we have the pleasure to have scholars from two different backgrounds, will be an interesting moment to reflect on different methodological approaches to Buddhist studies, to the advantages and the limitations of what maybe we can call the European and the Asian approach. And as of course, as it is represented by the individual endeavors of our two speakers today. So we will start with Chris Jones, and then we will go on to Zijie Li. They will both present the main point of their work, and then they will sort of shortly respond to each other, and then I will open the field to the floor to questions from the audience. We have a pretty large audience. I see about 60 participants so far. We had about 90 registered, so hopefully there will be enough time to cover all your questions and comments. Let me say something, and yes, you can place your questions in the QA section that you see at the end of at the bottom of the screen, and I will be reading your questions as this is a webinar format. Let me say something about our two speakers and our two authors. I'll start with Chris. Chris Jones took his PhD at the University of Oxford in 2015 with the supervision of the late Stefano Zacchetti, and is now research associate and affiliated lecturer at the Divinity Faculty of the University of Cambridge. And his dissertation was on the topic of the book that he will be discussing today, and was awarded the Khyentse Foundation Award, a special award for dissertation in Buddhist studies. The book that his first monograph that we will be discussing today is entitled The Buddhist Self on Tathāgatagarbha and Ātman, and was published at the end of 2020, as I was saying earlier, by Oxford University Press, I think. No.
It's Hawaii.
Hawaii.
University
sorry,
of Hawaii Press. That's fine.
Yes. The second speaker is Zijie, who is at the moment with us at SOAS as a Whole Foundation postdoctoral fellow in Buddhist studies. He took his PhD at Komazawa University in Tokyo, having been supervised by Ishii Kosei and Matsumoto Shiro, and did already a postdoctoral, spent a postdoctoral time at Jinbunken at the Institute of Humanities at the University of Kyoto, working with Funayama Toru. And his work, his publication, which is also comes out of his PhD, and came out at the beginning of 2020 with an eminent publisher in Buddhist studies in Japan, Kokusho Kankokai. It's entitled Kukyo Ichijo Hoshoron to Higashiyasha Bukkyo, Go Nanaseki no Noraizo Shinyo Shusho no Kenkyu, which can be translated as the Ratnagotra Vibhaga and East Asian Buddhism, a study on the Tathāgatagarbha, Tathāta, and Gotra between the 5th and 7th century. And so these are our authors today. I'll let you introduce your own work. So without further ado, I leave the floor to Chris. And I think you'll need a second to put on your PowerPoint.
I think so. And hopefully I'm audible now as well.
Yes, I can hear you at least.
Great. Just one moment while I get this together. And now hopefully you have a PowerPoint, which should also now be full screen.
Yes. Excellent. And we see you too.
Great. Thank you very much, Lucia, for the introduction, and thank you very much for hosting us. And thank you as well, once again, to Ulrich for those words about David Seyfarth Ruegg, who I will just acknowledge once again was a huge figure in Buddhist studies, but very specifically as well, the study of the materials that we're going to be talking about today. So one thing that people will immediately spot and may balk at in this presentation is the title of my monograph, The Buddhist Self. And I'd like to make one thing clearer before I start, which is that I'm not specifically interested in whether or not Tathāgatagarbha or Buddha nature is conceptually something like an account of the self that might have crept into Buddhism or something like that. Subtly different, my interest has been, or my primary interest has been, the fact that if we look at Indian Buddhist sources concerned with Buddha nature or Tathāgatagarbha, some of them explicitly say that this constitutes the Buddha's account of something that could be called the self. And that's been the starting point for my work. So my monograph is a reevaluation of a body of Indian Mahayanist works that are united by a common theme or a common interest in expounding what is meant by the well-known but enigmatic expression Tathāgatagarbha. My sources have been Indian Buddhist works, primarily works of sutra literature, but some commentarial texts as well, proper to the first 500 or so years of the Common Era. And some of these texts survive in Sanskrit, but for quite a few, we're dependent just on translations that survive in Chinese and or Tibetan. And an aim of the book, as the subtitle gives away, is to explore the associations in Indian Buddhist literature between, on the one hand, Tathāgatagarbha as an expression, and with it, one or other account of what we might call Buddha nature. And on the other hand, the relation of this to teaching or discourse about something that could be called the self, or of course in Sanskrit, Ātman. And it's well known that there is some interesting relation between teaching about Tathāgatagarbha, or Buddha nature, and discourse about selfhood. Now, of course, earlier and wider Buddhist teaching in India and elsewhere was committed to discourse about human identity and continuity through transmigration without making use of the notion of a self. That is a permanent, unchanging kernel to our existence, the knowledge of which, according to other Indian religious traditions, might be particularly valuable in the pursuit of liberation from rebirth. But Buddhist teaching in India was generally committed to teaching that no aspect of our experience warrants designation as the self or what is of the self. And Buddhism instead develops sophisticated ideas about transmigration that don't need the notion of an enduring aspect to what we are across lives. And yet we have teaching about Tathāgatagarbha, or Buddha nature. And this entails the revelation by the Buddha that there is something about us that is permanent, that is unchanging, and is moreover valuable insofar as this is the essence or qualities of a fully awakened being already somehow proper to our person. Now, what interested me at the start of this research in particular is that while some Indian Mahayanist works make the important distinction that teaching about Buddha nature is nothing like an account of the self, other works of this literature that have been somewhat less appreciated are quite different and state in quite clear terms that what is taught by Tathāgatagarbha is emphatically the Buddha's account of the self. And before I go further, I should talk about some of the terms that will be used today. Hopefully this is useful for this talk, but also for Zijie's later. And this is especially useful because no two authors are of the same mind with respect to how best to translate this expression to Tathāgatagarbha. And in fact, it's my habit to mostly leave it untranslated, although I do have opinions about how it could be rendered if we have to do so into English. That Tathāgatagarbha is used in different ways has led me to talk about this as a term that's used with reference to one or other form of what I call the Buddha nature idea. And this is the idea that what is proper to a Buddha, his nature or qualities, is always and already proper to sentient beings in general. And I'm deliberately quite broad or vague with this description, because it's wrong to generalize, for example, in terms of sentient beings having already the mind of a Buddha, because not all sources concerned with Tathāgatagarbha teach in this fashion. They don't make it about the mind. Tathāgatagarbha means, in a more literal sense, either the womb or embryo of or for a Tathāgata, that is, a Buddha. The Sanskrit garbha has the enduringly frustrating feature of meaning either womb, that is, some manner of container or chamber, with connotations of hiddenness or concealment, possibly also of generation. But garbha could also mean embryo, in the sense of something contained, that is precious and perhaps not yet fully formed. It's notable that reception of the term Tathāgatagarbha outside of India took two different directions. So Chinese translators from the 5th century onwards tended to render this with Ruegg. That is, it understood garbha to denote some chamber or some store. And by contrast, Tibetan translations from a few centuries later rendered Tathāgatagarbha with, most commonly, Dejin Shekbe Ningpo. That is, Ningpo, garbha as some essence of a Buddha, something precious that is substantial and contained, so closer to the sense of garbha as embryo. And different works of Indian literature use Tathāgatagarbha, the expression, differently. So in some sources, whether these survive in Sanskrit or otherwise, it looks like Tathāgatagarbha was used with reference to beings themselves. They are Tathāgatagarbha or characterized by Tathāgatagarbha. And this could mean that beings somehow contain a Buddha, or a different reading, that they are embryos or maybe children of Buddhas. This is a reading taken by Minoru. In some other Indian sources, though, and I think the majority of sutra texts, Tathāgatagarbha more clearly refers to something that sentient beings have or possess. So it's used with the verb asti. So sentient beings have about themselves, in themselves somehow, the womb or embryo of or for a Buddha. And the ambiguity of Tathāgatagarbha as a term in itself is just one of the headaches that we have with this literature. Related to this expression, and found across a number of Indian sources, are a set of related terms that are the origin of us talking about Buddha nature in English. Some texts concerned with Tathāgatagarbha equate its presence with the possession of, in Sanskrit, Buddha dhatu or Tathāgata dhatu, that is something like the nature of a Buddha. And this seems to have been commonly rendered in Chinese with expressions like Fortsin or Ruegg, and in Tibetan with Sangeki Kam or Sangeki Yin. Some works concerned with Tathāgatagarbha make a lot of the fact that this term refers to the presence of a thing called Buddha dhatu, whereas some other texts are less interested. In fact, don't talk about Buddha dhatu at all. and I should talk a little about my sources. Now, there's no evidence that Indian Buddhism knew per se what I'm calling a Tathāgatagarbha corpus, but I think this is a useful notion for scholarship, because the expression Tathāgatagarbha is far from ubiquitous in Mahayana Sutra or Shastric literature. And in fact, there's only a small set of Indian texts that are really interested in unpacking what Tathāgatagarbha means and relating it to some form of what I'm calling the Buddha nature idea. There are other Indian works that refer to Tathāgatagarbha in passing, so this could include the Mahayana Sutra Lamkara or versions of the Mahamegha Sutra, which is a particularly complex case. But to my mind, it's just the texts in this slide here that are those that really give attention to Tathāgatagarbha, what it means and how it, whatever it is, relates to sentient beings, to transmigration and to awakening. And the texts in this slide were considered by the great father of this field, that is Takasaki Jikido, who in the mid-70s studied all of these texts in their fullness. And he had a profound effect on everything that's come since in the study of this literature. And I could talk about many ways in which Takasaki has influenced us, but I want to pick up on just two things. So first, Takasaki was of the opinion that's still widely accepted that maybe the earliest text here in this slide, the earliest text to deal with Tathāgatagarbha was, on the left-hand side, the Tathāgatagarbha Sutra itself. Now, this is a text composed for the most part of a series of poetic similes that explain how sentient beings have one or other quality of the Buddha. And secondly, Takasaki understood that there was something like a main trajectory or a mainstream to teaching about Tathāgatagarbha in India. And this, he thought, began with the Tathāgatagarbha Sutra, and then perhaps more or less ended or came to maturation with the Ratnagotra Vibhaga. And of course, this great commentarial text was a focus of David Seyfried Ruegg's work throughout his career. And then between the Tathāgatagarbha Sutra and the Ratnagotra Vibhaga are some other, what Takasaki thought were the most important texts here, what could be abbreviated to the Shramala Sutra and the Anunatva Aparanatva Nidesha. But then apart from these, Takasaki separated out a set of three other sutra texts, which between them are only mentioned once in the great commentarial Ratnagotra Vibhaga. And one of these is quite well known. This is the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra, or what is commonly called just the Nirvana Sutra, after the title that it gets in Chinese. And this is a Mahayanist retelling of the final days and final teachings of the Buddha. There are then two other texts that are closely related to it quite clearly, the Angulimalaya and the Mahaberi Sutras. The Angulimalaya is a fascinating Mahayanist retelling of the conversion of the bandit Angulimala. In recent years, this received more attention by Kazuo Keno. And then we have the Mahaberi, that's a very odd and very unusual text, which more recently has been treated by Suzuki Takayasu. But all of these texts had some discussion by Takasaki already. So these three texts here, what he calls his Buddha nature works, are somewhat ignored, it would seem, by the Ratnagotra Vibhaga. And Takasaki writes about them as if they're representative of maybe some tangent or divergent stream away from how Tathāgatagarbha was more commonly or properly explained in India. But why might authors of the Ratnagotra Vibhaga have not given these texts much attention? Maybe they were too unorthodox, and it's not difficult to see why one might arrive at this impression. So in these next two slides, I'm showing some of the material in these sutras that has really interested me. And first, two passages from what I'm going to keep calling simply the Nirvana Sutra. What is called the self is the Tathāgatagarbha. The nature of the Buddha exists in every sentient being, but because it is obscured by all manner of afflictions, sentient beings cannot see within themselves its presence. Now, it's clear enough here that the presence of a thing called Tathāgatagarbha denotes the presence of a thing called Buddha Dhatu. But this also, I think plain as day, is referred to as the self. The Nirvana Sutra, the Angulimalaya, and the Mahaberi do not simply refer to Tathāgatagarbha as the self in passing. All three texts provide a litany of similes and short parables to explain, to the surprise of the audience in each text, that the Buddha is teaching an account of what could be called the self, or otherwise something that succeeds the Buddha's earlier teachings about not self. And we've got another passage here, again from the Nirvana Sutra. Sentient beings being of the world do not know the reality of the self, are influenced by bad companions, and are ignorant of the Buddha's use of cryptic utterance. So while the self indeed exists, they mentally cultivate only absence of self. I didn't want to make these slides too busy, and I've got limited time, so I'm not presenting here the additions for the source materials that are all in my monograph, but I've got references here to the relevant passages in Hiromi Habata's critical edition of the Tibetan Mahāparinirvāṇa. So it's fairly well known that the Nirvana Sutra says some odd things like this, but less well known are these two other sutras that teach in a similar mode. So this now from the Angulimala Sutra, and the person who's being chastised here is the Buddha's disciple Purna, who's only ever taught audiences that nothing about themselves should ever be considered the self. Not understanding the cryptic utterances of the Tathāgata, you, Purna, declare the Dharma to be absence of self, falling into the lamp of delusion like a moth that casts itself into a flame. Now, these are strong words. These texts explain that teaching about not self was for the purpose of clarifying that there are things in the world that are not the self. But here the Buddha is revealing Tathāgatagarbha, which, apart from all of that, does deserve to be considered as Ātman. And if that isn't shocking enough, here's now one more passage, this from the Mahāparinirvāṇa. If parinirvāna is complete annihilation, the world will be gradually destroyed. And this because as someone becomes a Buddha, leaves transmigration, there might be one fewer being if it's annihilation. But if it's not annihilation, then it is lasting and tranquil. Since nirvana is lasting and tranquil, and that's the position of the Mahāparinirvāṇa throughout the text, then certainly there exists a self, just as smoke means that there is fire. The Buddhology of these texts, which focuses on the status of a Buddha as an enduring transcendent existence, this necessitates, at least according to our authors, that there be something that could be called the self. And all three of our discourses make clear that this is otherwise what is called Buddha Dhatu, or the presence of Tathāgatagarbha. So content of my monograph deals on the one hand with these sutras and how they relate to Tathāgatagarbha, or Buddha nature, to discourse about selfhood, and also to the Buddhist teachings about not self, or absence of self. I also look at what other texts in this tradition have to say about all this. So returning to this corpus of Tathāgatagarbha works, the Srimāla Sutra, the Ragnagotravibhaga, and different again, the Lankavatara Sutra, bottom right, all have something to say about this. All of these works adopt some variation of the stance that if Buddha nature or Tathāgatagarbha looks like a teaching about the self, that's only provisional. Or rather that teaching about the self, in fact, is teaching about not self in some fashion. That's the slippery position of the Ragnagotravibhaga. To my mind, the Nirvana Sutra and its accomplices, if I can use that word, present what I'm calling an Atmavadin account of Tathāgatagarbha, or Buddha nature. That is, they teach Buddha nature in terms of the presence of a self, and other works in this corpus don't. In fact, they steer away from that. But was Takasaki right to conclude that these Atmavadin works, strange as they are, perhaps took the idea of Tathāgatagarbha from maybe the Tathāgatagarbha Sutra, and then took it in another radical or unacceptable direction? I think otherwise. There's another account of how all of this worked, and this is informed by some other recent scholarship concerning this literature. My monograph owes a debt to an argument advanced by Michael Radich in his 2015 study of the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra, again, Nirvana Sutra. Radich built upon important work on this text by Shimoda Masahiro and by Stephen Hodge, among others. And he built an argument that we've got good reason to think that the Nirvana Sutra is maybe the best contender for our earliest work in this tradition, the earliest work teaching about Tathāgatagarbha. And if we consider the alternative, there's some reasons to doubt maybe that the Tathāgatagarbha Sutra comes first. So Michael Zimmerman, in his pretty exhaustive study of that text, already recognized that the term Tathāgatagarbha seems to be supplied in the Tathāgatagarbha Sutra, maybe a later addition to its structure. On the other hand, argues Radich, both the narrative form and the doctrinal interests of the Nirvana Sutra suggest that it might be telling us what Tathāgatagarbha, enigmatic as the term remains, was supposed to communicate to early audiences. And I'm not going to go into great detail regarding Michael's thesis. I can't do it justice here, but I do find it persuasive, and I'll cut to the chase regarding what I think is important today. The Nirvana Sutra famously is an account of the Buddha's death, in which it is revealed that the Buddha is in fact beyond death, being as he is in his true transcendent mode of being, permanent and enduring. And in fact, the Nirvana Sutra says that the Buddha is Ātman, but let's leave that for now. So the text turns on its head the Buddha's nature in the world, being as this is just a docetic projection from beyond the world. And of course, it's not the only Mahayanist text in India to argue like that. But another feature of common narratives about the Buddha's death is an interest in the Buddha's relics. And of course, one expression for a Buddha's relic in Sanskrit is dhatu, as in Buddha dhatu. And in literary and in inscriptional sources, we find it sometimes said that a stupa, or a reliquary for a Buddha, is Tathāgatagarbha. That is, it is or has the chamber, garbha in the sense of a container, for the relic that is the enduring essence of the Buddha. And indeed, at one point, the Nirvana Sutra compares bodhisattvas who know themselves to have the essence of the Buddha to be like reliquaries and objects of worship for other beings. So this Mahayanist Nirvana Sutra is an account of the Buddha's relics, or the Buddha's enduring precious nature, in which these things are not meant to be hidden away in physical stupas, but concealed in all sentient beings, present at this mysterious space for a Buddha, their Tathāgatagarbha, from which future Buddhas might someday, through exertion, be revealed. Now, Radich's thesis with regard to the Nirvana Sutra is much richer than this, and he presents a lot of supplementary evidence, but I'm getting to the point for what I need to talk about with my work. If we accept that the Nirvana Sutra is our likely earliest text concerned with Tathāgatagarbha, then we have to deal with the fact that our earliest text in this tradition presented Buddha nature, or Tathāgatagarbha, as the Buddha teaching about the self. So back to the corpus one more time. The other two Ātmavādin works in this literature are doctrinally very similar to the Nirvana Sutra. They might not be so early, but they do, I think, continue the mode of teaching about Buddha nature that we find in the Nirvana Sutra. In other words, an Ātmavādin form. So what I explore through my monograph is a new picture of how this literature might fit together, working with the plausible hypothesis that the Nirvana Sutra is the likely earliest text named in this slide. Sources here deny or challenge or qualify the relationship between Tathāgatagarbha and teaching about the self. Now that includes the Shamala Sutra, but these things I think are surely later. In fact, the Shamala Sutra shows clear signs of knowing the Nirvana Sutra and maybe the Angulimala too. And in 2015, Jonathan Silk, in a publication, argued the Anunattva Apanatva Nirdesha develops ideas from the Shamala Sutra. And then the Ratnakotavibhaga, the Lankavatara, these two know the Shamala Sutra. The Tathāgatagarbha Sutra, meanwhile, is difficult to place, but it didn't seem to have leave a lasting impression on later Indian literature. But the Shamala, by contrast, is named or quoted by a lot of later works. And so now summing up, my argument is that the history of teaching about Tathāgatagarbha in India could be rethought, not only in light of Radich's thesis about the Nirvana Sutra specifically, but in light of all other kinds of evidence that suggests that the early life of the expression Tathāgatagarbha was tied up with something very radical, a Buddhist attempt to speak about something that could be called Ātman. The later life of the expression Tathāgatagarbha, which is still not late in the grand scope of Mahayana Buddhism, might begin with the Shamala Sutra, which I think creatively reimagines Tathāgatagarbha into something about the nature or purity of the mind. This is not a feature we find in these, what I'm calling Ātmavādin sources. And also, late in my book, I consider how adopting this new picture of the development of Buddha nature thinking highlights some other interesting features of this literature. And I'll only mention a couple of these in passing. Our so-called Ātmavādin sources, I think, are mostly untapped resources for teachings about emptiness in terms of one thing being empty of another, or extrinsic emptiness. So these works were known to the Dronangpa, the Dronang tradition in Tibet. But because there's been a stronger focus in Tibet on the Ratnakotavibhaga, these, what I think, earlier sources for teaching about emptiness of something else, such as the Nirvana Sutra and the Angulimala, have been less appreciated, especially by recent scholarship. And I'll add that the Mahāparinirvāṇa goes so far as to say that teaching about emptiness is all incomplete if there's no account of Buddha nature. Also fascinating is that virtually all of the texts mentioned here, but especially those that I think are early, exhibit undeniable knowledge and approval of what is taught in the Saddharma Pundarika or Lotus Sutra. And evidence for this is plentiful. It's my view that early teaching about Tathāgatagarbha in India was closely bound up with the ideas of the lotus, and specifically its own radical revelations about the Buddha's teaching that also turned Buddhist ideas on their head. The idea there's only a single vehicle of Buddhist teaching, and that means that the only kind of liberation that's a final liberation is achieving the status of a Buddha. And finally, I also have some thoughts about why early Buddhist authors in this tradition opted to use the language of selfhood. So we could imagine that it might have been possible to teach about something like an account of the self, something permanent, something precious, and a locus of power in sentient beings, without actually calling it Ātman, and thereby inviting controversy and some big hermeneutic problems. But relevant here is that our sutra text makes some revealing allusions to wider Indian literature concerned with selfhood. And I'm going to leave this matter to one side in case anyone wants to ask about it later. And it's quite possible that my reevaluation of this literature isn't convincing to every reader. And I'll acknowledge that the materials that I've been working with and translating are very difficult, and they're often confusing. But they benefit from further attention, I think, taking very seriously the quite bold things that these texts seem to be teaching us. And whatever the case, one thing that I hope to have demonstrated or drawn attention to is just how innovative and indeed contentious some Mahayanist composers or authors were in the early centuries of the Common Era. Thank you very much, and I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris. Thank you for also for introducing a lot of previous scholarship that I'm sure will help Zijie, Dr. Lee, going on with the discussion. So maybe shall we go straight to your presentation, Zijie? Yeah. Yeah, the screen.
Let me. Okay, I think.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thanks.
Lucia, thank you for having me. Good evening, everyone. My name is Zijie, my surname is Li. Today, the main theme of my presentation is, as you say, revisiting Buddha nature in Chinese Buddhism. So it is based on my monograph. The English translation of that is the Ratanagotra Vipak and the East Asian Buddhism, a study on the Tathāgatagarbha, the Tatha and the Gotra between the 5th and the 7th centuries. At first, I think in the introduction section, as Chris had introduced the definition of the Tathāgatagarbha, so I skip it. Allow me to directly enter my content. First, I want to discuss the relationship between the Tathāgatagarbha and the Buddha nature. As you know, the Buddha nature is an English translation or modern language translation. So, of course, we can use Buddha nature to translate the Tathāgatagarbha, not only the Tathāgatagarbha, you know, but the next line, Buddha Tadu, and Fo Xing in Japanese, Bu Xiu, Ru Lai Zang in Japanese, Niu Lai Zhou. We can use Buddha nature to translate all of this. But you know, in fact, if we strictly speak this problem, we will find that it is a complicated issue. The relationship between them is a complex issue. So this is the main point I want to discuss today. So the next one, the location of my research in Indo-Chinese Buddhism. Based on the discovery and the research on the Sanskrit text of Ratnagotravipaka in Chinese 宝性论, 究竟一生宝性论, our understanding of the Tathāgatagarbha in Chinese 如来藏. The Tathāgatagarbha doctrine in Indian Buddhism has been deepened. We know Edward Johnston and Tsukino Kenryu and Nakamura Zuiryu and so on. The important point is as the second portion of this page. As Takazaki Jikido noted, according to normal view, most important discovery based on the Sanskrit text of the Ratnagotravipaka is confirming the original Sanskrit term of 佛性 in Japanese Buddhist Buddha nature. An important thing that we learned from the Sanskrit of the Ratnagotravipaka is what the underlying Sanskrit term for Chinese term 佛性 was. What it means, concretely speaking, through the Sanskrit text of the Langavadara Sutra in Chinese 楞伽经, we can find the original Sanskrit term of 如来藏 is the Tathāgatagarbha. And similarly, through the Sanskrit text of the Ratnagotravipaka, we can find the underlying Sanskrit term for Chinese term 佛性 is Buddha or Buddha God. But here it is a topic we should further research, I suppose. This conclusion is just limited to the cases of the Langavadara Sutra and the Ratnagotravipaka, because we compare the Sanskrit texts of these two with their Chinese translations. But the conclusion we achieved, the correspondence between 如来藏 and the Tathāgatagarbha, between the 佛性 and the Buddha Tattva and the Buddha God. This is just limited to these two texts. This is what I want to say. Okay, next one. Is the above mentioned conclusion correct if we reconsider it from a historical perspective, namely the correspondence between 佛性 and the Buddha Tattva or Buddha God? The course of the translation works of a great number of Indian texts, of course, including the Ratnagotravipaka, were much more complex than we imagine if we merely consider the corresponding between the surviving Sanskrit, Chinese, and Tibetan texts. In the cases of the classical Chinese translation of the Ratnagotravipaka, the role of Chinese collaborators and disciples is important. It is likely that some monks of Dilun school in Japanese Jilonshu reflected their understanding into the Chinese text. It means some monks of the Dilun school had some influence on the production of the Chinese text. So the next line, this understanding, directly matching Chinese translation terms with Sanskrit terms in existent Sanskrit texts. Is this understanding a correct methodology? This is what I want to ask. It means that, as you say, if we discuss this topic beyond the Ratnagotravipaka and the Langavadara Sutra, is this conclusion exist or stand or not? This is what I want to discuss. So the conclusion for this section is the importance of investigating both Sanskrit texts and the classical Chinese translation within the framework of the history of Indian and Chinese Buddhism should be noticed. Okay, the next one is some previous research. I think you know Takazaki Nakamura, Shumi Taoza, and Professor Ruegg, David Ruegg. Okay, next, let me enter the discussion of the for the East Asian Buddhism. First, on the other hand, for East Asian Buddhist studies, when we discuss the Buddha nature and Rulaizang, the Tathāgatagarbha issues in Chinese Buddhism, the Dabo Niebhan Jing, Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra, the Shengman Jing, Srimala Devi Sutra, the Lengqie Jing, Langavadala Sutra, and the Da Sheng Qi Xing Lun, in Japanese, Daijō Qi Xing Lun, have been frequently mentioned and emphasized. I think many of you know. However, the influence of the Ratna Gotra Vipak, Jiujing Yishengbo Xing Lun, on East Asian Buddhism was ignored. This is maybe we can say the current situation for the East Asian Buddhist studies. And yes, next. Okay, next is, I must to mention this research very significant and fundamental Bussho no Kenkyu, namely a study on the Buddha nature, written by Tokiwa Daijo. This is a very old, very old, nearly 100 years ago, very old monograph. This book is based on the perspective of controversy between Zhongxing, Gotra, and Foxing, Buddha nature, in Sui and Tang dynasties in China. After the publication of this book, Tokiwa's book, most previous research on the Buddha nature and Rulaizang Tathāgatagarbha issues in East Asian Buddhism had been more or less influenced by Tokiwa's hypothesis, especially his theory of the controversy on single vehicle and three vehicles. In Chinese, 三一诠释论证, Japanese, 三一即公即次论说. However, the controversy between Zhongxing Gotra and Foxing Buddha nature in Chinese Buddhism originated from the return of Xuanzang from India to China. That is to say, it is dangerous to utilize Tokiwa's idea of a controversy regarding the vehicles to analyze the theory of Buddha nature before Sui dynasty. In other words, since Zhongxing, Gotra, Foxing, Buddha nature, and Rulaizang, the Tathāgatagarbha, are the Buddhist terms which came from India, so it is inevitable to consider their Sanskrit origins if we attempt to probe the history that they were translated into Chinese and understood in East Asia. I think there is a very important point I must add, is that the controversy between Zhongxing, Gotra, and the Foxing Buddha nature. When I discussed this with Chris several days ago, he said it is a bit unclear for his understanding. Yes, definitely. I think I must say, the Zhongxing, Gotra, and Foxing Buddha nature. On Tuesday this week, I made a presentation for a Japanese scholars panel. So some young scholar, asked me that in his opinion, in Indian Buddhism or in the earlier Mahayana text scriptures, in this step, maybe the Gotra and Tadu, the relationship between Gotra and Tadu is unclear or is close, in other words. But if you ask a scholar on East Asian Buddhist studies, he or she will tell you these two terms are very different from each other in East Asian Buddhism. Why? Because the 佛性, Buddha nature in East Asian Buddhism. It indicates the possibility to achieve the Buddhahood. But 种性 culture, we can say, maybe I can say it, we can consider it as a classification of all beings, for all beings, depending on their possibility for Buddhahood. So concretely speaking, some group of beings, they can easily or not easily, directly achieve the Buddhahood, like Bodhisattvas, Pusa, or Buddha. So this group is one sort of culture. Some others can only gradually achieve the Buddhahood. So we can consider them another sort of culture. But the most important point is whether there is a sort of beings can never achieve the Buddhahood. In Sanskrit, it is called Ichantika, for example. Where is the Ichantika actually? Or does the Ichantika actually exist or not? Is a fundamental in some sense, a fundamental topic for East Asian Buddhism. So if Ichantika doesn't possess, if they can't achieve the Buddhahood, the reason is that they don't possess Buddha nature, 佛性. So this is a fundamental discussion. But again, we must remember this controversy actually began after Xuanzang's return. Xuanzang translated much more texts into Chinese. And unfortunately, Tokiwa Daijo, as you know, he didn't use any Sanskrit and Tibetan text. So we can't forget these terms like Tathāgatagarbha and Gotra, they came from India. This I want to and next we Hakuju, some Japanese scholars, what they did, I think many of you. And according to Takazaki, there was a trend respecting the Ratna-Gotra Vipak in the Huayan, in Japanese Keigon sect, which probably came from the Diren school. So Takazaki had recognized the importance of the classical Chinese translation of Zijie. And next, recent years, for example, Matsumoto Shiro and the Chinese scholar Cheng Gongrang, they realized the importance of the Ratna-Gotra Vipak, especially according to Cheng Gongrang, Fazang, in Japanese, Hozo. Fazang wrote a commentary named the Dasheng Fajie, Wucha Bielun Shu, but didn't leave the commentary of the Ratna-Gotra Vipak. Many scholars downplay the influence of the Ratna-Gotra Vipak on Chinese Buddhism. However, Cheng found that the Ratna-Gotra Vipak had been frequently cited in various treatises in East Asian Buddhism, including Fazang's Dasheng Fajie, Wucha Bielun Shu. So I want to add that not only the case of Fazang, but many topics, many issues in East Asian Buddhism, we can find the influence of the Ratna-Gotra Vipak. And the next one is some very detailed discussion, but I think I must mention it. Please allow me to read it. The three parts of the Tathāgatagarbha's definition, Talamagaya, the Tatā, and the Gotra, have been changed into another set in Ratna-Gotra Vipak's Chinese translation as 法身真如佛性 the 佛性 here is not the Chinese translation term of Tadu, but Gochu, compared to the case that Tadu is translated as also as 真如性 in the Chinese translation of the RGV. And the Tata in Chinese, 真如, in Japanese, 信有, Tata, was usually regarded as one kind of unconditional Dharma in Indian Buddhism, especially in Yogacara Vada. But the Tata's action and movement, like conditional Dharma, was not admitted in Indian Buddhism. Very possibly, the tendency admitting the Tata's rise relates to 真如佛性 in the Ratanagotra Vipaka, as translated by Ratnamati, before the translation of the Dasheng Qixin Lun. So the term Gotra is frequently used in the Ratanagotra Vipaka's Sanskrit text, compared to its absence in the Chinese translations of this treatise. Instead, in the classical Chinese translation, 真如 combines with 佛性 as 真如佛性, this term, and becomes a foundation or reason for the transmission and the transmigration in the world. Okay, this is the old image of the Tathāgatagarbha sutras. I think Chris had mentioned it. Let me skip it. Okay, the contents, next, the contents of my monograph. Through my monograph, I explore the theories on the Tathāgatagarbha, Tathā, and Gotra in East Asian Buddhism between the 5th and the 7th centuries, with a focus on the interpretation and the influence of the Ratanagotra Vipaka Baoxing Lun. I review and reconsider that the Tathāgatagarbha and the consciousness-only theories in the context of East Asian Buddhism, especially before the return of Xuanzang to China. And in this book, I explore the ideological background of the classical Chinese translation of the RGV through the research on the Pusa Di Chi Jing, and you know, it is a Chinese translation of a section of the Yogacara Pumi, and several kinds of commentaries of the Srimala Devi Sutra. And I also discuss the series of the Tathāgatagarbha and the Tata in the Ruleng Qie Jing, Chinese translation of the Langabhadara Sutra. And in comparison to the surviving Sanskrit text, the Chinese version of the Ratanagotra Vipaka downplays the significance of the expression Gotra, and instead reflects abundant interest in 真如 Tata and 佛性 Buddha nature, such as 真如佛性 becomes a foundation or reason for transmigration in the world. And in addition, I also discuss the relationship between the RGV and the Paramartha, Mazhendi, and the Dasheng Qixin Lun, and the Jizang, Fazang, the Sanjie Jiao, Sanjie sect. And in addition, I also traces the influence of the Ratanagotra Vipaka beyond China, such as the Korean monk Won Hyo, and its influence in Japan, centering on the Gokyō Shōshiji, written by the Tōdaiji monk Jūryo, and the Kishin Yushiki Doisho, written by Chike of Kofukuji Temple. Okay, at last, let me record my conclusion. The discovery in the Sanskrit text of the Langabhadara Sutra in Chinese Leng Qie Jing proved that the correspondence between Rulai Zang and the Tathāgatagarbha is correct, but not in all cases. However, the conclusion achieved after reading the Sanskrit text of the Ratanagotra Vipaka, namely the correspondence between 佛性 and the Buddha nature, Buddha Tatu or Buddha Gotra, is available for merely some texts, which means that it is necessary to consider the translator's understanding and the decision when we deal with a specific text. And there are major differences between our Sanskrit text of the Ratnagotravipaka and its classical Chinese translation, which had a wide-reaching influence on East Asian Buddhist thought that has yet to be fully explored. Furthermore, Chinese commentary of the Ratnagotravipaka in East Asian Buddhism hardly remained. So the opinion that the Ratnagotravipaka was not regarded too much in Chinese Buddhism and East Asian Buddhism remain strong in even today's Buddhist academic world. The finding of my research revealed that the Chinese translation of the Ratnagotravipaka had more influence than previously imagined in East Asian Buddhist intellectual history. Okay, that is my presentation. Thank you for hearing.
Thank you very much, Zijie. I think maybe if you stop sharing, we can come back to the common platform. Well, this is a very hard tour of texts and periods. It was kind of interesting to see how both of you were emphasizing terminology and consequences that the choice of specific terms have and the misunderstandings that can be created by equivalences that may be possible but are not exclusive. That I think is the point that both of you would like to convey. And it's been also interesting to see how the interaction of sources remains fundamental for understanding specific developments. I really have a lot of questions I would love to ask immediately, but maybe I should, as we said, you should respond to each other. Who wants to start? Maybe, Zijie, are you ready to respond to Chris?
Yes, if possible.
Maybe, yeah, just one or two questions so that we see how among you, I know that you have already spoken a bit about your reciprocal work, but it would be interesting for us to hear about that. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation, Chris. I think I should just ask one question because I don't want to waste too much time. I think you mentioned the new latest research of Professor Michael Redditch. Yes, as everyone knows, it is a very important, pretty important research, especially on the location of the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra. And you know, when I was in Japan, I heard some scholars mentioned a pretty famous scholar on East Asian Buddhism, Kamada Shingeo. He always said, if we just take up one text, one sutra to represent the East Asian Buddhism, for Chinese Buddhism, this text is Nirvana Sutra. For Korean Buddhism, this is the Huayanjing Keigong-kyo. For Japanese Buddhism, is the Lotus Sutra. Yeah, so we know the importance of the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra for Chinese Buddhism. But as you know, I'm focused on the Ratnagotravipaka, always forgotten by East Asian Buddhist scholars. But I want to further know the relationship between the Mahāparinirvāṇa-sutra and the Ratnagotravipaka. You know, according to the Takazaki Jikido's research, he mentioned it is sacred for the history of the Tathāgatagarbha scriptures because we can merely find the quotations or the quotations from the Nirvāna Sutra in the Ratanagotra Vipaka. So, I mean, the Ratanagotra Vipaka merely mention or cite of the passages from the Nirvāna Sutra. But so I wonder if, as you said, the Nirvāna Sutra was compiled earlier than the Ratanagotra Vipaka. Why did the Ratanagotra Vipaka? Why didn't it cite?
Why isn't it cited so much? Okay. Yeah, it's a tricky question. And this is, so before I go further, thank you again for your presentation. We spoke about your other presentation the other day as well. And there's always more to learn about the Ratanagotra Vipaka and its different versions. And I'll come back to this, but struck by just how different the Chinese is. But with respect to your question, so the Ratanagotra Vipaka has just a single quotation of what I'm just going to call the Nirvāna Sutra in it. There's just one passage quoted. Otherwise, I think there are a few passages of the Ratanagotra Vipaka Vyakya that are traces of the memory of what is being taught in the Nirvāna Sutra. But the Ratanagotra Vipaka is a commentary, and it's selective, and it's got the authors have they have an agenda, they have an idea of Buddha nature that they're advancing. And they do this with reference to the Shamala Sutra primarily, and the anātman, and then also similes from the Tathāgatagarbha Sutra. And I suppose if a commentary like this is being composed, they can afford to be selective. And although the Nirvāna Sutra was known, the Shamala Sutra, I think in the thoughts of these commentators, is the clearer text, or the text that works for how they understand Buddha nature. So I suppose my way of thinking about it is maybe this. Takasaki had the idea that the Mahāparinirvāṇa and these other texts that talk about Ātman might have been something like a divergent path in Indian teaching that the Ratanagotra Vipaka wasn't interested in. And my idea instead is that maybe they're not strictly divergent, but maybe this is what this was early on. Because we see traces of influence and responses to the Nirvāna Sutra in the texts that the Ratanagotra Vipaka uses. So I think it's very difficult to sum up in just a couple of words, but I think the Ratanagotra Vipaka doesn't use the Nirvāna Sutra because thinking about Tathāgatagarbha had moved on in India. And the authors didn't see that as their good source. It was the Shamala Sutra and the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra. But we could talk at greater length about what the Ratanagotra Vipaka is doing as well. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I think you are introducing here another important element that is the chronology of certain notions. It seems to me that the temporal factor should be taken into account much more than it has been done so far. And that's also what comes up from Zijie's talk. So how do we, to what extent the temporal placement of these texts affects the way in which we can reconstruct a certain notion?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm trying to do that I know quite slippery, and it's a challenge, is that I'm trying to identify debts that one text may have to another, and what look like references or allusions that suggest relative chronology. And there are problems with that, and there are counter arguments for the kind of things that I suggest. But this is what leads me to think that the Shamala knows. If it doesn't know the Nirvāna Sutra, I think it knows what it was saying. I think it knows of the existence of what it was teaching. And then we can start to build an idea of how one thing responded to or contains responses to another kind of teaching. And then at the end of this, we have the Ratanagotra Vipaka, which, if I can say one more thing, responding to what Zijie was saying, so a big focus of his work is the idea that the influence of the Ratanagotra Vipaka has been not so much considered in scholarship in East Asia. It's fascinating. If you talk about Tathāgatagarbha in the company of Tibetologists and Buddha nature in Tibet, it's the Ratnagojavibhaga. And then there are these sutras that are also there, but the Ratnagojavibhaga is so important that and so formative in what happens in Tibet that's the lodestar, that's the point of reference. And then, of course, as Zijie said, in East Asia, there's the Mahāparinirvāṇa, but you're arguing that the Ratnagojavibhaga has a greater influence that has been underappreciated, if I understand you correctly.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. If I can respond with one question then. So one of the terms that you brought in, and I hope this doesn't get too niche or too esoteric, but you mentioned ichantikas.
Yes.
And you mentioned so the idea of certain individuals who, for one reason or another, are incapable of attaining any form of liberation. And in East Asia, we have earlier debates and disagreement about whether or not there are, or what an ichantika is, based on the Nirvana Sutra. But the Ratnagojavibhaga also says things about ichantikas. So I was wondering how what the Ratnagojavibhaga says about them feeds into debates and discussion in China in one or other period.
Yes, certainly. It is a pretty significant question, I think. As you know, in East Asia, you know, there was a tendency or a theory of that even not just the beings, even the trees and the botany and the stone can achieve the Buddha. So I think in the minding of the East Asian people, it is very difficult for them to really accept the idea of ichantikas. So definitely, as you said, to be honest, I must confess, I didn't take the ichantika in the Ratnagojavibhaga series so far, because maybe most of the East Asian Buddhist monks ignored it. But as you know, it not just appeared in the Ratnagojavibhaga, but the Nirvana Sutra. So when the Mahāparinirvāṇa Sutra was translated in China, there was a big controversy occurred in China, discussing whether the ichantika exists or not. But maybe I can say, unfortunately, at last, the idea that this argument that the ichantika actually doesn't exist. This idea won. Yes. So I think, yes, we should maybe we should launch a new research about the ichantika in East Asian Buddhism. There is no
project. It's a very good plan. I intervene so that at least we have more of a conversation here. It seems to me that there is also a bit of a shift in the way in which Zijie has responded just now, from the text to the people who read the text. So this is a really very important, and again, maybe another point to highlight. It's not just saying, yes, in the text the ichantika appeared, but nobody takes mentions of it, doesn't pay attention to the fact that they are there. So that's again another important factor in how we read this text. Do we read them through our own, through what the text says, through the lines, or we read it through what the community around them has done as read, basically, is a kind of an attempt to reproduce how they were read at a certain moment. And that's why perhaps at the moment, I mean, at which moment we are talking about, which point are we talking about, that becomes so important.
Yeah, it's a tricky issue with the texts that are the greater focus of what I've been doing, because one of the features of them is Indian commentators don't mention them, and that's really conspicuous as well. So the Mahāparinirvāṇa, the Angulimala, the Mahāberi, I'm yet to find mentioned in any demonstrably Indian text, which is a bit suspect, but we've got two translations that I think suggest that it's not something produced elsewhere. An interesting thing is that where the texts that I was mostly focused on, the Nirvana and the Angulimala, where they are mentioned by commentators later on, it's not in connection to any of this stuff about selfhood, it's in connection to vegetarianism, because they seem to be two of our earliest texts. They received new attention in a massive 3-part monograph by Lambert Schmidhausen this last year. These texts might be our earliest sources talking about how bodhisattvas aren't meant to eat meat, which is another part of this puzzle that also feeds into things in East Asia. But this is a long-winded way of saying that we see certain texts in India come up in commentaries, but the things that I found really interesting are things that are not commented on and don't tend to be mentioned, at least in India, but in East Asia it's another matter.
Yes, Chris, I wonder whether you want to ask your or have any comment, further comment to TJ, so that we start taking the questions.
Sure. Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot to unpack here, and I mean the methodological, or the difference in focus of looking at the Ratnagotravibhaga and what I'm doing is pronounced. And as I already said, even earlier this week, we were looking at the Chinese Ratnagotravibhaga and finding all of these differences. And as you say, the fact that the term Gotra that is there and really important in the Ratnagotravibhaga seems to be downplayed or less represented in East Asian translations. I suppose related to this, I have to ask this, it comes back a little to the Achantika thing, but you were talking as well about the debate over number of vehicles. Yeah, and I wonder where, and this can be just my ignorance regarding reception of this as well, where does the Ratnagotravibhaga fit in this picture? Because the more I've looked at the Indian text, the more I get confused working out its particular stance. I don't think it's clear. So how does the Ratnagotravibhaga fit into this debate in East Asia about how many vehicles there are?
Yes, thank you, Chris. It's a fundamental question, I think. I think there is some, we should do some much more work to further research this issue in Chinese Buddhism. But as far as I know, at least in Japanese Buddhism, the Zijie, the patriarch of 10 dissect, Zijie, he cited and mentioned the Ratnagotravibhaga, module 宝性论, frequently, many times. So if we discuss the situation of the controversy between the one vehicle and the three vehicles in Japanese Buddhism, I think the answer is that the Ratnagotravibhaga fits the one vehicle side. But in Chinese Buddhism, it's a bit complex. I think, very few scholars mentioned this issue, I think. But my teacher Matsumoto Shiro, he argued in 2013. He argued the Ratnagotravibhaga also can fit the three vehicle side. But
how? What was the argument?
Of course, he didn't focus on the Japanese or Chinese. He just discussed in Indian Buddhism. He attempted to demonstrate that this conclusion can stand in even Indian Buddhism. But who knows?
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, regarding the text itself, it continues to confuse and frustrate because the thing is composite and it has strata, and by the end of it, you're looking at, or the later stages, you're looking at something with a strong Yogacara character in many ways. But I'm very influenced by Takasaki and then Schmidhausen's investigation of what might be earliest there, and that looks very different in a lot of ways. And whoever's composed those original materials, I think, might have had very different ideas about these arguments regarding vehicles, whether these things happen in India or East Asia. Okay.
Shall we start taking some of the questions, maybe? They are very long questions, so I'll have to read them. And I actually, in the meantime, I see a chat on the chat, a comment from Michael Radish, I think, it was in the audience, so I think maybe I should start from there. And Michael says, well, thank you for your interesting presentations. Dr. Lee, you proposed that Dylan thought was a factor in key translation choices in the Chinese translation of the Tathāgatagarbha. Do you see any possible relationship between the situation envisioned in this hypothesis and the scenario of composition of the awakening of faith, as recently re-examined by Otake Susumu?
Yes.
So maybe do you want to respond to that? Thank you, Michael, for a very interesting question.
Professor Redditch, thank you very much. Thank you for your hearing and the question. I think we met several years ago at Kyoto University, but they didn't meet once after that. You mentioned the research of Otake Susumu. I met him once a year when I was in Japan. Of course, he's an extraordinary scholar. So, you know, as you mentioned, about the compilation and the establishment of the Mahayana awakening of faith. Otake analyzed the awakening of faith by sentence by sentence. And he pointed out that the author of the Mahayana awakening of faith definitely consulted the Ratnagotra Vipaka Baoxingluan. So it is undoubtedly that there was a strong relationship between these two. But the problem is what degree of the Dilun school inserted this topic. So many of you may know, I think the Ratnagotra Vipaka was translated by Ratnamati, and the Mahayana awakening of faith was closely related to Bhatti-Ruchi, or the people surrounding him. But they are just related to these two Indian monks. And how the conclusion I can say is that I think it is very possible between the Mahayana awakening of faith, the Jiujing Yishan Baoxingluan, and the Dilun school. Yes. And of course, I agreed with the conclusion of Otake Susumu. But I think In my opinion, I want to argue that the author of the Mahayana awakening of faith definitely consulted the 究竟生活性论. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I have another question that is more general, but it sort of resonates a bit with what we were saying earlier on. Matthew Aldridge asks, so what are the causes and conditions for the arising and development of these ideas? Were there specific pressures within the cultures at the time, which may relate to the chronology? In general, is this idea that the glass is half full, that essencelessness is the essence? That is there a discussion? Is this a discussion of expression rather than content of the fundamental principles? First, Chris, that's for you.
Okay, and there's a few layers to that. I'll talk about maybe what I understand by causes and conditions behind these things. One thing that I haven't done in the monograph is address or try to come up with one conclusive answer about where Buddha nature is coming from, or what Tathāgatagarbha as well related to it. What if there's one particular cause for this? I'm not sure that's helpful. And what I tried to focus on instead is why, if we're looking at the early life of this tradition and things like the Nirvāna Sutra, then why is this couched in terms of selfhood? And in that literature, what we find is whatever Buddha nature is, it's discussed in quite corporeal terms. It's meant to be something that is within you. That's the language that's used, but not of the world. It's no worldly notions of the self, but it is there somehow. It is there to be seen by those who have particularly advanced faculties of Buddha, but otherwise can't be seen. So it does look quite strange in terms of what I'd say, if we're looking at literature in the early Common Era, would be conventions of Buddhist teaching. One thing that I have tried to argue is that we're looking at, well, there's two biggest influences, I think. First of all, the Lotus Sutra. I do think that plays a huge part in this. As a text that is known to these Tathāgatagarbha works, the Nirvāna Sutra mentions it by name, for example, a text that makes liberation about being a Buddha in very emphatic words. That's what liberation is, not that of an arhat or anything else, it's Buddhahood. And so this now that's the stage set for arguing, for thinking about, well, how is the exalted status of a Buddha as something utterly transcendent and magnificent, how can that be present in all beings? And so that is one factor, I think, in the early life of this thinking. The selfhood aspect to it is a more complex thing. I think that we've got Buddhist texts here that are responding to a broader Indian religious climate that is still interested in knowledge of something that could be called the self. And one of the things I talk about later on in the book is the Brahminical texts that might have been known to our authors. We have little clues about this that are alluded to, Brahminical ideas at any rate. And our authors are saying, well, the self is not any of that you've heard, but nevertheless, it looks kind of similar in some ways. And even, we're told, worldly notions of selfhood, whatever you hear outside of the Dharma, those gesture towards the Buddha's account of the self. So we've got a text that's really pushing the fact that the Mahayana has to it some account of what could be called Ātman. And maybe that is for competitive purposes in a religious intellectual marketplace. Maybe this is a Mahayanist tradition that's wanting to have something that could be presented as an account of the self.
I wonder whether, Zijie, you want to add something about this point, as we could see in China. In the very title of your book, you emphasize a specific time span from the 5th to the 7th century, and I wonder what is it that is important there from the cultural point of view, and the effect of I mean, what was around at that moment in China in specific choices. You're muted, Zijie, you're muted.
sorry, sorry for me. I think it's a bigger topic. We can say a lot about it, but here I just want to say one point. This is not other scholars' previous research, but my own understanding is the second half of the 5th century. This period is extremely significant for the intellectual doctrine of Chinese Buddhism, because, as you know, after the translation by Kumarajiva and the Nirvāṇa-mahāsūtra we discussed, from the middle of the 5th century, the translations from the Indian texts temporarily stopped. Of course, not entirely stopped, but relatively stopped. And from the beginning of the 6th century, the Dilun school, Jilongxu, and many other Tathāgatagarbha texts and Yogacara texts were again translated. But the second half of the 5th century, I think this period is Chinese traditional culture period. As you mentioned, the Chinese monks and the Chinese intellectuals, they created a lot of apocryphals. Yes, Kikyo, Yijing, yes. So I think this is, we must say, this is a transformation step. Yes, that's all.
So the fact that you're saying that the fact that there wasn't more coming in
mixture,
much more articulation of what was already there, more creatively, you're saying, basically.
Yes.
That's interesting. I have another question here, and that's I'm reading it. What's your view of Richard King's suggestion that Tathāgatagarbha literature arose in reaction to misunderstandings of the meaning of Madhyamika teaching? That they needed something to counter what they thought was nihilism. No, who wants to take this? Maybe.
I think that's me if we're talking about the beginnings of this. Well, first thing I'd say, I wouldn't strictly say that, and I can't remember quite how King puts this. I wouldn't strictly say Madhyamaka so much as, let's say, Prajnaparamita and so perfection of insight literature itself, maybe. I'm not sure whether Madhyamaka is the thing, but it is the case that if we have Prajnaparamita literature that's very concerned with saying all things are empty, all things like Swabhava and so on, I won't go too far into that. One feature of what I think might be our earliest texts here is an account of extrinsic emptiness. The Nirvāna Sutra says that emptiness is the emptiness of all of these things that shouldn't be there from the liberated state. The Angulimala also has passages that present emptiness in this fashion. In other words, in a way that doesn't sit so comfortably with perfection of insight literature. So in that we have Angulimala berating Manjushri for not understanding emptiness and how there are things that in fact are not empty, and these are the qualities of a Buddha and the liberated state. Now, whether the question is what to do with that now, I think there is a good argument to be made that our Buddha nature sources are, at least in part, a response to the perception of a difficult nihilistic account of what is and how that can relate to liberation, and wanting to preserve the fact that liberation is a real enduring experience in a way that's not the language that's used in Prajnaparamita literature. So I have some time for that. I guess I wouldn't make it about Madhyamaka so much, but maybe that's a Madhyamaka reading of Prajnaparamita that I'm giving. So maybe I do agree. I hope that's not unclear.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't have any more questions here from the audience. It was pretty packed talk, I suppose. So I wonder whether you wanted to have other points, to make other points to each other, since I know that there were many.
I mean, I think I pick up again one more time on something that Zijie and I talked about the other day as well, which is the fashion in which in East Asia it looks like. He talked about correspondences in translation and how it looks like we have Fotsing as something that exceeds or gathers together lots of ideas, lots of different terminology, perhaps picked up from India, which I think is a really important observation, especially with respect to the Ratnagotra Vibhaga. I suppose one thing that I'd say to that looms in my mind is when we're looking at our earlier sources, there had been after Takasaki the idea that the sutra literature that we're talking about here wasn't so interested in Buddha Dhatu, the key term that I'm focusing on. And I'm finding that we actually find in these Indian sources that aren't what the Ratnagotra Vibhaga is very focused on. In those sources, there's more discussion of Dhatu. We find it hinted at in wordplay and similes that play on different understandings of the Indic term Dhatu. But then we're in a different world again when we're looking at this commentary, the Ratnagotra Vibhaga, and how Fotsing is something that has evolved from Chinese understanding of, I think, Buddha Dhatu into something that's become something very different, that's now being used as a lens through which to read this commentary, the Ratnagotra Vibhaga. I should arrive at a question, I suppose, with this, but I wonder whether when you've looked at the reception of that text, the Ratnagotra Vibhaga, do those who receive it also think about Fotsing as it was taught in the Nirvana Sutra, which looms large? Is there a weighing up of the way that both texts talk about Fotsing, and do they detect tensions, or are these things seen to work together?
Yes, Chris, the question you asked, to be honest, is maybe the most important next step for my research, namely so I asked you just now that question, the relationship between these two in India. I really want to further know that. Yeah, because if we know much more about this question, the conclusion of this question in India, it definitely benefits our further understanding for this in East Asian Buddhism. Of course, if we roughly consider this problem, of course, all of us can say, because the Nirvana Sutra was first earlier translated into Chinese, and the Ratnagotra Vibhaga was late. So it must have been influenced by the translation terms of the Nirvana Sutra. Of course, roughly, we can achieve this conclusion. But you know, the most important thing I wonder is whether the original terms of them are the same or not. If not, it is a big problem.
Yeah. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And how do we reconstruct that? That's a big question, I suppose. How do we go through, trace
Yes.
the genealogy of these terms?
So fortunately, we have the Sanskrit text of the Ratnagotra Vibhaga. So I can make some comparison. So I found Sanskrit Gotra had been translated as 真如佛性, as I just said. But so I think we must further research the Nirvana Sutra in East Asian Buddhism. As far as I know, the Ocho Enichi, did some tremendous.
Long time ago.
Yes, but you know, he didn't use other language text.
Yeah. We have another question here from Jingjing Li. It says, thank you for your wonderful presentation. I have a question for Dr. Li. In Shuangcang Chen Wei Xi Leng, he uses what literary meaning as the nature of seeds, and literary meaning as the family name of seeds interchangeably, although both Chinese terms correspond to the Sanskrit gotra. So that's what you were saying earlier on. In this equation, I suppose, merely Xuanzang composition, or does it predate Xuanzang and can already be found in early Yogacara literature, both in Sanskrit and the Chinese language?
Yes, Jingjing, thank you for your question. This is another fundamental question, I think. You mentioned the first term you mentioned of 种姓, the first one, that xing. I think, you know, I investigate the texts where this 种姓, the first 种姓, was used. I found most of them are those before Xuanzang's return to China. Of course, after that, there were some, but most of them are before Xuanzang's return. But the second 种姓, the female left this 种姓. As you know, Xuanzang used this 种姓for many times. So I think it's a topic we should further research, but currently what I can say is, you know, I wrote a paper about this on the Pusa Di Chi Jing, is also a chapter of my book. The Pusa Di Chi Jing, you know, was translated by Tathāgatagarbha, the same translator of the Nirvāṇa-mahāsūtra at the beginning of the 5th century. It is another translation of the Yogacara Bhumi, one section of Yogacara Bhumi. There are two types of gotra in this text. Tathāgatagarbha translated them as 性种姓 and 习种姓, namely principal gotra and habit gotra. This term set he used is the first 种姓 you wrote. But if the stage came to Xuanzang's translation, all of them became the second one. So I think it is a very interesting issue we should further research.
So, but do you think it's from, I mean, is that a new thing that Xuanzang introduced, or was it existent already?
Yes, maybe I haven't concrete evidence for this, but just my imagine or my own thinking. Maybe Xuanzang attempted to separate the gotra 种姓 from the Buddha nature, because as you know, the Buddha nature 佛性, that 性 is the first 性 of the 种姓 Jingjing wrote. So maybe Xuanzang used the female left 种姓 to divide them, but I haven't evidence about it. Yes.
I wonder, maybe at this point I can ask you a small question I've been having for a while. Just what you continue to mention the importance of Xuanzang's return from India. What is this? How would you qualify the importance of this moment? Why is it so important?
I think the most impact Xuanzang brought into China is what I just recorded in my PPT PowerPoint.
It's about what he brought in, the texts that he brought in, or the ideas?
The ideas.
I mean, the ideas in the sense of the other translation, the possible translations.
Yes, I think, of course, Xuanzang's return changed many part of Chinese Buddhism, but I think we can't ignore one pretty important point is the existence of the Ichantika. So, Xuanzang asserted that there is definitely the existence of Ichantika. They never achieved the Buddhahood. But many other Chinese monks argue. Yes.
You think? Yes. Okay. I think we should conclude here. We actually normally finish a little bit earlier, but the discussion seemed so articulated that I wouldn't want to stop it. So let me thank you all for the presentations, both for the presentation and our audience for staying with us for so long and so carefully. Something else came up, sorry, all of a sudden, but it's just a comment that says that the gradual development of various doctrines in the topic in India and in East Asia tradition is really fascinating. I fully agree with that. And I'm sure there would be much more to find out through more interactions between researchers on both sides of the really very strange divide that we put between in the Indic world and the Chinese world. So I look forward to many more occasions to discuss the details of this encounter, exchange, and the developments that followed. And I thank you all for being with us today. I'd like to remind our members and anyone who wants to attend that we have another talk next week, actually on the 25th. And that will be on Japanese Zen, on medieval Japanese Zen by Dr. Licha, Kigen-san Licha, former student of us. And we will have another event in March, one of our whole foundation lectures in Chinese Buddhism, which will be announced. That will be the 18th and the 19th of March. Will be announced in a while. That will be on contemporary China. So I look forward to see many of you again, or at least to know that you are behind my screen. Have a good evening or a good day wherever you are in the world. Bye-bye.